On the 8th of May 1945, 8 days after Adolf Hitler committed suicide, Admiral Karl Donitz signed Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies, ending the Second World War, which had lasted 6 years and claimed some 75 million lives. 75 years later, what does this mean for those living in Africa? While a typical Hollywood narrative is one of Americans coming to the rescue with the D-Day advance, the contribution of the Russian military, who managed to defeat 60 German divisions over the course of important battles in Stalingrad, Kursk, and Operation Bagration, must be noted. An important effect of World War II was not so much the new hegemony of well-entrenched global superpowers that would be created in the likes of the USA and Russia, but the dismantling of the modern European empires, an era kick-started by the voyage of Christopher Columbus to the Americas in 1492. Empires are born out of pragmatic reasons, access to trade routes, important commodities, etc. Christopher Columbus was hired by the Spanish crown to seek a sea passage to what was then referred to as the East Indies, now Asia, in hopes of benefiting from the lucrative spice trade, but he ended up landing in the Americas. This discovery of the New World would lead to waves of expedition for conquest and colonization, first by the naval powers of those east of the Atlantic, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. The rest of Europe would catch up, and with the wealth of these empires tied to resources from the colonies, the rest of the world was carved up among most of these powers, limited only by the size of their ambitions. Prosperity, coupled with an explosion of knowledge as encapsulated in the period of the Great Enlightenment, seemed to have placed Europe and Europeans above other races. Pseudoscientific thoughts such as these were used to justify slavery and slave labor. Darwin's theory of evolution was interpreted to give credence to such claims. The start of the 20th century saw off the last vestiges of slavery and the subsequent arrival of colonialism, as evidenced by the Berlin Conference at the tail end of the 19th century. But the 20th century would do little to end the nonsensical race theory that had pervaded much of Europe's minds. These thoughts continued to be echoed by laymen and noblemen alike, from Lugard's disparaging description of the Nigerian tribes to newly stoked fears that the European racial supremacy was threatened. Madison Grant's 1916 Passing of a Great Race was a known favorite of Hitler's. Hitler's racial pogrom, along with his designs of a new German empire, was not such an uncommon act among empires and colonizers. It, however, was the first of its kind in Europe and executed with such brutish efficiency that where similar acts had been carried out by the Japanese in China or Italy's failed attempt in Ethiopia were ignored, collective action was taken to halt the German advance. Hitler's actions would eventually cause the European empires to buckle under the weight of war. India would leave the English Empire in 1947, 2 years after the end of the war. The United States emerged as probably the biggest winner of the war, both economically and reputationally. The hold of the European empires on their colonies was tenuous at best and would come apart in the decades to come. This was the context under which Nigeria and other African countries gained independence. This push for self-determination and casting aside the shackles of the colonizers was rooted in Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism was the idea that Africans on the continent and in the diaspora had common interests and common threats. The likes of Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, and Julius Nyerere saw the independence struggle in Africa and the civil rights struggle in the United States as the same struggle. We live in a vastly different world than our great-grandparents did, and it was largely the legacy of the Second World War. Instead of a world dominated by European empires, we live in a world of independent states, largely enjoying the global security cover and the trade flows it has made possible, provided by the world's dominant superpower, the United States. There is a lot to say about the fall of the Iron Curtain, America's current turn to isolationism, and the economic rise of China as a global challenger as defining moments in global history. But these pale in significance to the end of the order established by Columbus and other adventurers, which was accelerated by the most devastating conflict in the history of humanity.